So if you think that the financial crisis is already bad enough and that inflation is already hurting your pockets enough, just wait until the ramifications of the absolutely historic over $700 billion that have been injected into the banks and into these zombie corporations such as Credit Suisse. So for instance, last week, Credit Suisse was already given a historic $54 billion to keep it from the verge of collapse. Yesterday, bankers woke up in a pool of sweat because they were worried that Credit Suisse, even with those $54 billion, was going to collapse, and with it you would have a financial domino effect that would spill out over the entire economy, where the derivatives bubble that is reaching over $2 quadrillion would collapse. I think it is very useful to look at the assets versus derivatives ratio of the top 4 major banks in the United States. So, for instance, you have JP Morgan, which has $54.3 trillion in derivatives against $3.3 trillion in assets. That's a 16-to-1 ratio. Citibank has $46 trillion in derivatives with $1.7 trillion in assets. That's a 27-to-1 ratio. Now, Bank of America has the best of all the 4 major banks in the United States. It has $21.6 trillion in derivatives, but still only $2.4 trillion in assets. So that's a 9-to-1 ratio. Now, this is where it truly gets unbelievable. Goldman Sachs has $51 trillion in derivatives against $500 billion in assets. That's $500 billion versus $51 trillion in derivatives. That is a 99-to-1 ratio. So you can see the system is absolutely collapsing. There is very little future for an economy when you're running on complete funny money that has nothing to do with the physical economy. Now, I want to present to you as well that number I stated earlier of over $700 billion being injected over, or promised to be injected over the last week. So you have, like I mentioned, the Swiss National Bank issue with Credit Suisse. So you have $54 billion plus the $225.6 billion. On top of that, you also have the $175 billion of promised bailing out of the depositors for Silicon Valley Bank. Signature Bank has already had $89 billion committed to it. The Silvergate Bank has $14 billion committed to it, and another potential $278 billion to the tab. And then there's First Republic Bank, which, despite the $30 billion bailout in cash from 11 large U.S. banks, it is still hanging by a thread. There's also been talk about the bank's total deposits, which the Treasury is considering so-called making whole. This is a complete violation of both the law and the FDIC's authority, and this will add another whopping $176 billion to this massive bailout scheme. By the way, all of this information is available on the Executive Intelligence Review, which I highly recommend you subscribe to for more in-depth analysis of these events. So any way you look at it, we're talking about a $720 billion bailout scheme of these financial institutions. That way you don't see what Lyndon LaRouche characterized as a thermonuclear fallout of the Western financial system. And this is what Lyndon LaRouche talked about for over 40 years and what he predicted, especially since what happened in 1971. Now, I think it'll be useful to compare the United States versus China and the Chinese economy and their assets to derivatives ratio. So think of derivatives somewhat like a tick on a dog. That tick is draining the real economy and it's draining the real physical development of a country's infrastructure. So compare the United States to China. The United States, $173 trillion in derivatives, only $8 trillion in assets. Meanwhile, China's top 4 banks have $7 trillion in derivatives versus $19 trillion in assets, more than twice as much as the United States. So I want you to think about that the next time you hear someone say that the United States has the world's strongest economy. Now, on paper, that might be true. We might have the so-called strongest economy. We certainly have lots of political control over money all over the world. But all of it is entirely fake. Look at the conditions of New York City. Look at the conditions of the country at large. There's nowhere you could go to really escape the industrial collapse that we've been facing as a country over the past 40, 50 years. Now, the only industries that are really even surviving these days are the ones that are intrinsically connected to the military and the military-industrial complex. How are we going to get out of this mess? How are we going to build more wealth? How are we going to achieve real growth, meaning a quality of life improvement for the people? How are we going to achieve this? It's not going to be by printing out more money and handing it to the banks. It's going to be by building infrastructure, by building mega projects such as the World Land Bridge. It's going to be by investing in science and research and development and developing our fusion and even fission capacity. That's what China's doing. That's what Russia is doing. It's time that the United States abandons this disastrous and parasitic Federal Reserve and instead goes down the route laid out by Hamilton, laid out by Kerry. And we have a national bank that directs money directly into infrastructure, not into parasitic bankers. Hey, thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoyed my first update. I'm going to entirely depend upon you guys supporting me to be able to do this. We all know that money is tight right now, but if there's a way that you could find to support us by making a donation, you'll unlock special access to the Executive Intelligence Review, which is the main source that I used to compile this video together. Furthermore, you'll get access to the weekly magazine, which is fantastic. It has scientific articles, it has political articles, and it is absolutely worth reading, and it is absolutely worth the money of a subscription. Plus, you'll be supporting me. So please, subscribe to the EIR, and subscribe to my personal YouTube channel, No Limits to Growth with Space LaRouche. Thank you.